Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I stand before you today to share my truth.
Let me take you back to a time before the courtrooms, before the headlines. This is the story of Emma Rostov, and to understand how her world fell apart, you first have to see how beautiful it was. Picture this. It's 3:45 on a Tuesday afternoon at Oakwood Heights High School. The final bell has rung, but Emma's classroom is still full. Not because anyone has to be there, but because they want to be. Sunlight is streaming through the big windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air. And there's Emma, sitting on the edge of her desk, surrounded by a handful of students. They're not talking about grammar, they're dissecting a poem, arguing about what the author really meant. And she's listening, really listening, to every word. You could see it in their eyes. They weren't just students to her. They were future writers, thinkers, scientists. She saw the potential in every single one of them. On her desk was a mug that read, "World's Okayest Teacher," a joke from her husband, David. But the sticky notes plastered all over it. "Thanks for the extra help, Ms. R. You're the best," told the real story. When she finally got home, the scene was just as perfect. Her house smelled like David's famous garlic-roasted chicken and the crayons of her 7-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily would come barreling into her legs, clutching a new drawing, and David would smile from the kitchen, his apron covered in flour. This was their sanctuary. After putting Lily to bed, they'd curl up on the couch, and David would rub her feet while she graded papers. He'd tease her, "Still saving the world, one essay at a time?" And she'd smile, because in that moment, it felt like she was. But see, Oakwood Heights wasn't just any town. It was the kind of place where people mowed their lawns on Saturdays without fail, where the pressure to be perfect was as thick as the summer humidity. The kids weren't just applying to college. They were waging war for a spot at the Ivy Leagues, and their parents were the generals. Emma knew this. She felt that pressure every day. She just never imagined she'd get caught in the crossfire. It all started with an email. Just a few lines in her inbox, sent at 9:17 p.m. on a Thursday. The subject line was simple, "Urgent question." It was from Ethan Moore, one of her brightest seniors. And the message? It was polite, but there was a tremor of panic underneath the words. "Ms. Rostov, I know it's late, but can I please meet with you tomorrow? Alone? It's really important." She typed back without a second thought. "Of course, Ethan. My room is always open." She had no idea that with those 4 words, she was already opening a door she could never close. So, the next day, after the final bell had echoed through the empty hallways, Emma waited. Her classroom was quiet, just the hum of the old aquarium filter in the corner and the soft tick of the clock above the whiteboard. This is when she usually felt most at peace, surrounded by the ghosts of the day's lessons. But today, the air felt heavy. Ethan Moore slipped in, closing the door softly behind him. And the boy who walked in wasn't the confident, debate team star she knew. This Ethan was pale, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. He looked shattered. "Ms. Rostov," he started, his voice cracking. "I messed up. I did something really stupid." He told her a story. He'd panicked during a practice quiz for the National Merit Exam. "Just a small, internal practice test," he said, "nothing official." But he'd glanced at his phone, looked up a definition. He'd been caught by the testing software's automated proctor. It was a momentary lapse, a blip. But if it went on his record, he said, his scholarship to Stanford, his full-ride scholarship, would vanish. His parents would be devastated. His future over for one stupid mistake. Emma listened, her teacher's heart breaking for him. She saw the tears welling in his eyes, the genuine tremor in his hands. This wasn't a hardened criminal. This was a good kid, a kid she'd written college recommendations for, who was cracking under the immense pressure they all lived with. "Ethan, you know I have to report this," she said softly, her mind already racing through the bureaucratic nightmare it would cause. And that's when he played his masterstroke. He looked her dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I know. And I'll accept whatever the school decides. But, the automated log, it says the violation happened last Thursday during 4th period. But I was here, Ms. Rostov. I was in your classroom, during my free period, asking you about my college essay. Remember? Emma blinked. She scoured her memory. Last Thursday. She had so many students in and out. It was possible, even likely, he had been there. But she couldn't specifically remember it. If you could just tell them I was with you, he pleaded. Just confirm my whereabouts. It's not even a real lie. Not really. I'm always in here. You know I am. This just makes the paperwork match the truth of who I am. That was the hook. It makes the paperwork match the truth of who I am. He wasn't asking her to lie. He was asking her to correct an injustice. To vouch for his character. To be the kind of teacher who fights for her students. Her stomach was a tight knot. Every professional instinct screamed no. But looking at his face, seeing the sheer terror there, she thought of his future. She thought of all the good he would do. She convinced herself she wasn't obstructing justice. She was saving a life. Okay, she heard herself say, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. Okay, Ethan. If anyone asks, I'll tell them you were with me. The relief that flooded his face was instantaneous. It was like watching a drowning man finally gasp for air. He thanked her over and over, his voice thick with emotion, and then he was gone, leaving her alone in the suddenly very quiet room. She sat back down at her desk, her heart thumping. It felt wrong. But she buried the feeling. She was a good person. She was helping. She went home that night and told David about the poor, stressed-out kid she'd helped. He'd hugged her and said, "That's my Emma, always seeing the best in people." And she'd leaned into that, using his belief in her to quiet the unease squirming in her own gut. She had no idea she hadn't just told a lie. She had handed a stranger the matches that would eventually burn her entire life to the ground. For about a week, nothing happened. The knot in Emma's stomach loosened. Life went on. She graded quizzes, helped Lily with her spelling homework, and almost managed to forget the whole thing. It was just a tiny secret, she told herself, buried under the mountain of her everyday life. But secrets have a way of cracking the ground beneath your feet. It started with a rumor. A whisper in the teacher's lounge about the school board launching a broad investigation into academic integrity. Something about the National Merit Practice Exams. Emma's heart did a little flip, but she kept her head down, stirring her coffee, pretending she hadn't heard. Then, the email arrived. It was from the principal, Dr. Evans. The subject line was cold and formal, mandatory meeting academic protocols. It was addressed to her and a few other teachers. Her hand trembled slightly as she clicked it. The message was vague, but the threat was clear. They were asking questions. The meeting was in the school's main conference room, a place usually reserved for celebrating achievements. Now, it felt like an interrogation chamber. Dr. Evans and a stern woman from the school board sat on one side of the table. They were polite, but their eyes were all business. They asked general questions about testing procedures, about how teachers monitored students. Emma's palms were damp. She nodded along, her voice a little too high when she answered. And then the stern woman looked directly at her. "Ms. Rostov, we're cross-referencing some digital logs with teacher sign-in sheets. Can you confirm your whereabouts on the afternoon of Thursday, the 12th? Specifically, during fourth period." The air left Emma's lungs. This was it. The moment she'd foolishly hoped would never come. Every instinct told her to come clean, to say she'd made a terrible mistake. But she saw Ethan's terrified face in her mind. She saw his future crumbling. And her own fear, the fear of being caught in a lie, was even more powerful. She cleared her throat. "Yes," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I was in my classroom. I had a few students stopping by for extra help during their free periods. Ethan Moore was one of them. He was with me, working on his college essay." The lie was out. It hung in the air, solid and real. The woman from the school board just made a note on her legal pad. "Thank you, Ms. Rostov. That's all for now." Emma walked out of that room feeling like she'd just run a marathon. She thought she'd passed the test. She thought the worst was over. She was wrong. So wrong. Because a few days later, two men in crisp, dark suits were waiting for her in the principal's office. They introduced themselves as detectives. And the word they used wasn't cheating. It was fraud. They weren't interested in a single mistake anymore. They were investigating a sophisticated, for-profit cheating ring. Students were paying to have their tests taken and their essays written. And all the threads, they said, led back to a core group of students. One of whom was Ethan Moore. Emma felt the world tilt. A cheating ring? For profit? This wasn't a panicked kid making a mistake. This was something else entirely. Something calculated and cold. The final blow came from one of the detectives. He opened a folder. Ms. Rostov, our forensic audit shows that your digital keycard was used to access the West Wing printer, the one connected to the testing office, on that Thursday afternoon. At the exact time the system logged the testing violation. The same printer that was used to run off copies of stolen answer keys. He let that sink in. Her keycard. Her access. She had provided an alibi for a crime she never knew was happening. She wasn't just covering for a scared kid. She had become an accomplice. The tiny lie she'd told wasn't a pebble dropped in a pond. It was a crack in a dam. And now, the whole wall was about to come crashing down on top of her. The days after the detectives visited were a blur of pure dread. Emma moved through her life like a ghost. She'd be reading a bedtime story to Lily, but her mind would be in that office, hearing the word fraud. She was trying to act normal for David, but the fear was a constant, icy knot in her stomach. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on a Tuesday morning. Just a regular Tuesday. She was in her classroom before first period, writing the day's agenda on the board, Introduction to Gatsby. The smell of whiteboard markers and old books. Normalcy. The door opened. It was Dr. Evans, the principal. His face was a grim mask. And behind him were the two detectives. The air in the room just vanished. "Emma," Dr. Evans said, his voice tight. "These gentlemen need a word." One of the detectives stepped forward. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. It was just procedure to him. "Emma Rostov, you have the right to remain silent." The words hit her like physical blows. You have the right. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. She heard them through a roaring in her ears. This wasn't a meeting. This wasn't a suspension. This was an arrest. She barely registered what happened next. They guided her hands behind her back. The cold, hard metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. The weight of them was a shock. It was so final. This was really happening. And then they walked her out of her classroom, into the hallway that was now filling with students. The bell for first period had just rung. A sea of faces turned toward her. Her students. Kids she'd taught for years. Their eyes wide with shock, their phones already coming up, recording. She saw the confusion, the judgment. She heard a gasp. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, her face burning with a shame so deep she thought it might swallow her whole. The walk down that endless hallway, past the lockers and the bulletin board she'd decorated, was the longest walk of her life. They put her in the back of an unmarked car. Not a dramatic squad car with sirens, just a quiet, sedate sedan, which somehow made it worse. As they pulled away from the school, she caught one last glimpse of the building in the side mirror. Her life. Her identity. Everything she was in that building. And they were driving her away from it in handcuffs. The car stopped at the county jail. The processing was a blur of fingerprints, mugshots, and being handed a stiff, orange jumpsuit. When the heavy metal door of the holding cell clanged shut behind her, the sound echoed in the stark, empty space. She sat on the cold, concrete bench, the rough fabric of the jumpsuit scratching her skin. She looked at her hands, now without the cuffs, but still feeling their ghost. She was no longer Emma Rostov, the teacher. She was inmate number 78704. And in the space of a single morning, her golden life had been erased. After the cold shock of the jail cell came a different kind of chill, the slow, dawning realization of what she was really up against. David, God bless him, had scraped together every penny they had, mortgaged the house, and hired the best defense attorney they could possibly afford, Sarah Chen. She was sharp, young, and had a reputation for being a fighter. Their first meeting wasn't in a cozy office. It was in a sterile, windowless room at the courthouse, the air smelling of antiseptic and fear. Sarah sat across from them, a legal pad open, her pen poised. She wasn't there to offer hugs. She was there to assess the damage. "Okay, Emma," Sarah began, her voice calm but direct. "Let's talk strategy. The prosecution's case is circumstantial, but it's a story, and right now, it's a story the jury will believe." She laid it out like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. The Moores, Ethan's parents, were not just wealthy, they were connected. They had hired Robert, the Viper Vance, a legendary defense attorney famous for making evidence disappear and witnesses crumble. And he wasn't defending Ethan by claiming innocence. Oh no. He was offering the prosecution a villain, Emma. "Ethan has given a full statement," Sarah said, watching Emma carefully. "He's saying the lie was your idea. That you were a mentor in this cheating ring." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "What? That's insane. Why would I?" "Motivation," Sarah cut in, her voice flat. "Vance is constructing a narrative. He's suggesting you were either taking a cut of the profits, or—" She paused, choosing her words carefully, "that you had a twisted emotional need for your student's success. That you blurred the lines between teacher and something else. That your compassion was really a pathology." David slammed his hand on the table. "That's monstrous. Everyone knows Emma. They know her heart." Sarah didn't even flinch. "David, in that courtroom, they don't know her. They only know what they're told. And they're being told that a teacher, in a position of trust, exploited a system for her own gratification. They're painting Ethan as a scared kid manipulated by a charismatic authority figure." Emma sat there, stunned into silence. Her single act of misguided kindness was being twisted into something predatory. Her life's work of caring was being used as a weapon against her. She wasn't being accused of a mistake, she was being cast as the mastermind. Sarah leaned forward, her expression deadly serious. "You need to understand what we're facing. This isn't about truth anymore. It's about power. The Moores have it. They are building a wall between their son and prison, and they are using the bricks from your reputation to do it. Your goodness is just a weakness they are eager to exploit." Emma looked from Sarah's grim face to David's anguished one. The last flicker of hope, the belief that the system would simply see she was a good person, guttered and died. She was in a war she never signed up for, and the first shot had been fired directly at her heart. The courtroom wasn't what Emma expected. It was smaller, quieter. The wood was dark and polished, absorbing the light and the sound. Every whisper echoed. For Emma, sitting at the defense table with Sarah Chen, it felt less like a search for truth and more like being trapped in a hall of mirrors, where everything she knew about herself was being reflected back at her as something monstrous. It started with the prosecutor's opening statement. He was a clean-cut man named Mr. Sterling, with a calm, reasonable voice that made his words even more devastating. He didn't paint her as a mustache-twirling villain. He painted her as something the jury would find more familiar, and more terrifying, a person who cared too much. "This is a case about lines," he said, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "The lines between teacher and student. Between compassion and corruption. Emma Rostov didn't just cross that line, she erased it." He laid out the facts, the lie, the keycard access, the cheating ring, but he strung them together with a sinister thread. Her dedication to her students wasn't passion, it was an unhealthy obsession. Her willingness to help Ethan wasn't kindness, it was a pathological need to be the hero. He was taking her greatest strengths and methodically poisoning them. And then, they called Ethan to the stand. He looked like the all-American boy. He wore a simple, respectful suit. His voice was soft, contrite. He admitted his role in the cheating ring, his head bowed in shame. He said he was so sorry. And then, when Mr. Sterling asked him about Emma, His performance was chilling. "Ms. Rostov, she was always so nice to me," he began, his voice trembling just enough. "She told me I was special, that the rules were for other people. When I got caught, I was panicking. I went to her for advice. And she said it was no big deal. She told me exactly what to say. She said she'd vouch for me, that teachers look out for their favorite students." Emma felt like she'd been punched in the gut. She stared at him, this boy she'd championed, this kid she believed in, and she watched him methodically build her coffin, nail by nail. He was lying, but he was doing it with such convincing remorse that you wanted to believe him. Then came Sarah Chen's cross-examination. She went in hard, trying to expose the deal he'd made with the prosecution, trying to paint him as a selfish liar saving his own skin. "Isn't it true, Ethan, that you are testifying against Ms. Rostov in exchange for all charges against you being dropped?" Ethan looked up, his eyes wide and sincere. "I'm testifying to tell the truth, ma'am. To take responsibility for my part." He was unshakable. And then, he delivered the most subtle, brutal blow of all. Sarah asked him why he thought Emma would do such a thing. Why risk her career? He paused, as if searching his soul. I think she saw how much my parents loved me, how much they were involved in my life. And she doesn't have that. I mean, she and her husband, they adopted their daughter, right? I think she wanted to feel that connection, that importance. Like she was the most important person in my life. The air went out of the room. He had taken the most beautiful, loving thing about her family, their adoption of Lily, and twisted it into a pathetic, emotional void she was trying to fill. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. Emma looked at the jury. She saw it click into place for them. The story wasn't about a lie anymore. It was about a lonely, unfulfilled woman who used a child to feel powerful. The teacher they thought they knew was disappearing, replaced by this funhouse mirror reflection, this distorted stranger. And in that moment, Emma Rostov began to doubt who she was herself. After Ethan's testimony, Emma felt broken. The courtroom felt like it was pressing in on her, the air thick with the jury's judgment. For days, the prosecution had built its case on this idea of her as a corrupted, manipulative figure. But then, it was their turn. The defense's turn. And Sarah Chen began to fight back. She started by calling a parade of character witnesses. It was like watching a highlight reel of Emma's entire career. A young woman, now a doctor, who said Emma's after-school tutoring saved her grade and her confidence. A soft-spoken young man who said her drama club was the only place he felt he belonged in high school. One after another, they stood up and painted a picture of the real Emma Rostov. The lifeline. The believer. You could feel the atmosphere in the room begin to shift. The jurors, who had been looking at Emma with stern disapproval, now seemed to be studying her, reconsidering. One older woman in the front row even gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope. David, sitting behind her, squeezed her shoulder. This was working. They were seeing her. Sarah gave her a confident look. This was the plan, remind them who Emma Rostov truly was. And then, the prosecution stood up. Your Honor, the state calls one final witness. Maya Jenkins. The name meant nothing to Emma. She watched as a young woman made her way to the stand. She was slight, with a quiet seriousness about her. She wasn't from Oakwood Heights. You could tell from her thrift store cardigan and her nervous posture. She looked like a student, but her eyes were much older. Mr. Sterling approached her gently. Maya, can you tell the court what school you attended last year? She spoke in a clear, soft voice. Oakwood Heights High. I was a transfer student. I was on a full-ride scholarship. Emma was confused. What did this have to do with her? Maya, what were your plans after graduation? Sterling asked. I was going to attend Stanford University, she said, and a wave of understanding, cold and dreadful, began to wash over Emma. I had a full scholarship. The Covington Scholarship. The same scholarship Ethan Moore had been competing for. Sterling let the silence hang for a moment. And what happened to that scholarship, Maya? She didn't cry. Her voice was flat, factual, which made it all the more powerful. I lost it. It was given to another student. Ethan Moore. Emma's heart stopped. No. No, no, no. Sterling pressed on. And why do you believe you lost it, Maya? Because the scholarship committee saw his final transcript and his extracurricular record. They saw a perfect, unblemished record. They didn't see the cheating. They didn't see the lie that covered it up. She didn't even look at Emma. She just stared straight ahead, at some painful memory only she could see. And what was the consequence of losing that scholarship? Sterling asked, his voice barely a whisper. My family. We don't have money. There was no plan B. Her voice cracked for the first time. I couldn't go. I watched my parents cry. My mom picked up a third job. I work at a diner now. I'm taking one class at a time at the community college, paying for it myself. It will take me 6 years to get a degree, if I'm lucky. The reality of it crashed down on Emma with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about a legal technicality anymore. It wasn't about her reputation. Her one, stupid lie hadn't just protected a guilty kid. It had actively, directly, destroyed an innocent one. She had been so focused on the bullet aimed at her own head, she never stopped to look at who was standing behind her. Maya Jenkins. A girl she had probably passed in the hall a dozen times. A girl whose future was brighter than anyone's, built on sheer grit and talent. And Emma, with her compassion for the privileged popular boy, had reached out and snuffed it out. The jury wasn't looking at Emma, the corrupted teacher, anymore. They were looking at Maya, the real victim. And in that moment, Emma Rostov finally understood. She wasn't the victim in this story. She was the cause. Can you imagine? Thinking you're the victim, only to realize your single action destroyed someone else's life. What would you have done if you were Emma in that moment? Could you have lived with that guilt? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. After Maya Jenkins left the stand, the trial was over. There was nothing left to say. The air in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer about arguing over facts and timelines. It was about something much, much heavier. It was about consequence. The judge called for closing arguments. Mr. Sterling, the prosecutor, went first. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood before the jury, his hands clasped, and he spoke to them like he was explaining a terrible, simple truth. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began. For the past few weeks, we've talked about lies. About keycards and transcripts and cheating rings. But that's not what this case is really about. This case is about a door. He paused, letting the silence hang. A door to a future. For one student, that door was kept open by a lie. For another, it was slammed shut by that very same lie. Emma Rostov didn't just tell a falsehood. She stood at that door and made a choice. She chose the privileged, connected boy over the quiet, deserving girl. She chose the easy path over the right one. He walked slowly to the evidence table and picked up a piece of paper, a copy of Maya's lost Stanford acceptance letter. He didn't wave it around. He just held it up, a silent, damning exhibit. This, he said softly, is the weight of a consequence. This is what was stolen. Not money. Not a grade. A life. A future. The defense will ask you to look at Emma Rostov's lifetime of good works. But I ask you this, what good is a lifetime of building doors if you then get to choose who walks through them based on who you like better? Based on who cries the loudest? He looked each juror in the eye, one by one. A prison cell isn't just for monsters. Sometimes it's simply for the absolute, unavoidable weight of a choice. The choice to destroy one life to save another. Hold her accountable for that choice. He sat down. The courtroom was utterly silent. It felt like even the clock on the wall had stopped ticking. Then, it was Sarah Chen's turn. She fought. She was passionate, her voice rising with emotion as she spoke of Emma's character, her decades of service, her one terrible mistake made under pressure. She called it a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness. "Emma Rostov is a good woman who did a bad thing," she pleaded. "She is not a criminal. To send her to prison is to throw away a life that has, on the whole, been dedicated to lifting others up. Don't define her by her worst moment." But her words, however powerful, sounded different now. After Maya's testimony, after the prosecutor's closing, the word mistake sounded small. Selfish. The argument about a lifetime of good works now felt like someone trying to pay for a stolen car with a pocket full of loose change. It wasn't that the jury didn't believe Emma was a good teacher. It was that they now believed it wasn't enough. It didn't balance the scales. The judge gave the jury their final instructions, the definitions of reasonable doubt, the elements of the crimes. The words were dry, legal, but they fell on Emma like a sentence already passed. The jury stood and filed out of the room to begin their deliberations. Emma watched them go. She searched their faces for any sign of the sympathy she'd seen just a day ago. But their eyes were downcast, their expressions unreadable. They were carrying the story of Maya Jenkins with them into that room. And Emma knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was a story her lifetime of good deeds could never hope to overcome. The door to the jury room clicked shut, and the waiting began. For Emma, for David, for everyone in that stuffy courtroom, time became a strange, stretchy thing. It slowed down and sped up all at once. The first 5 minutes felt like a victory. David squeezed her hand so tightly it almost hurt. He leaned in, his voice a hushed, excited whisper. 18 minutes, Emma. That's nothing. They probably took a quick vote, and it was unanimous. Not guilty. They saw through it all. A wild, giddy hope bubbled up in Emma's chest. It made sense, didn't it? The case was circumstantial. Sarah's character witnesses had been so strong. Maybe the jury had just looked at each other, shrugged, and said, "This is a waste of time. Let's go home." She allowed herself to picture it, the foreman saying, "Not guilty," the weight lifting, the judge apologizing for the inconvenience. She and David would go home, order pizza, and try to forget this nightmare ever happened. They'd get their life back. Those 18 minutes were a countdown to freedom. Then, 10 minutes in, a man a few rows behind them, a court reporter or a regular observer, muttered something to his colleague, just loud enough for Emma to catch. Fast is never good for the defense. Fast means they found something they all agreed on immediately. And it's never not guilty. The hope in her chest curdled, turning into something cold and heavy. She looked at Sarah Chen. Sarah wasn't smiling. She was staring at the jury room door, her brow furrowed, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the legal pad. She didn't look like a lawyer who thought she'd won. She looked like a doctor waiting for lab results she already knew were bad. 15 minutes. The initial adrenaline had worn off, and in the terrible quiet stillness, Emma's mind had nothing to do but replay the trial. And it kept landing, like a record skipping on a terrible groove, on Maya Jenkins. Not on Ethan's lies, not on the prosecutor's speech, but on Maya's face. The flat, empty look in her eyes. The way she said, "I work at a diner now." And that's when the acid of realization began to eat through the last of Emma's hope. This wasn't about legal technicalities anymore. The jury wasn't in there debating the definition of perjury. They were in there talking about Maya. They were talking about the diner, the lost scholarship, the third job, the 6 years it would take to get a degree. They were looking at the human cost of her single, stupid decision. She had been so focused on her own tragedy, her own ruined life, that she had never truly seen the carnage she'd left in her wake. She wasn't the victim. She was the cause. And if she were on that jury, hearing about a teacher who destroyed a girl's future to protect a rich kid's reputation, what would she do? She would convict. The thought was so terrifying, so absolute, that a small, choked sound escaped her lips. David looked at her, concerned, but she just shook her head, unable to speak. The beautiful fantasy of going home, of pizza and normalcy, evaporated, replaced by the stark, cold image of a prison cell. 17 minutes. A bailiff walked over to the jury room door and stood beside it, ready. It was a small movement, but it screamed finality. They were coming back. The buzzer sounded, a sharp, electronic bleat that made everyone in the room jump. It was time. As people shuffled back to their seats, the air now thick and electric with anticipation, Emma looked at the jury door. She wasn't hoping for freedom anymore. She was just praying for a different kind of hell than the one she knew she deserved. The 18 minutes were up. Her old life was over. Whatever came next was beginning now. The door to the jury room opened, and they filed back in. It had only been 18 minutes, but they looked like different people. Their faces were pale, drawn. Not a single one of them would look at Emma. They stared at the floor, at the walls, at their own hands, anywhere but at the woman whose life they held in theirs. The hope that had been a flickering candle in Emma's chest was snuffed out, completely, by the simple refusal of eye contact. The judge's voice was a distant rumble. "Mr. Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a man in a blue button-down shirt, stood up. He held a single piece of paper, and his hand was trembling. Just a slight, almost invisible tremor, but Emma saw it. She saw it, and she knew. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk walked over, took the paper, and brought it back to the judge. The silence in the room was so absolute that Emma could hear the rustle of the paper, the hum of the fluorescent lights above. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. The judge scanned the paper, his expression giving nothing away. He nodded to the clerk. The clerk, a woman with a neutral, professional voice, turned to face the courtroom. She cleared her throat. "On the count of perjury, we the jury, find the defendant guilty." The word wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. It was just a word, spoken plainly into the quiet room. But it hit Emma with the force of a physical blow. A sharp gasp went up from the spectators behind her. David's hand, which was clutching hers, went limp. Emma didn't move. She couldn't. It was as if the word had turned her to stone. The clerk continued, her voice the only sound in the universe. "On the count of obstruction of justice, we the jury, find the defendant guilty." There it was. Again. Guilty. It was over. The fight was done. The story had been told, and the ending was not the one she had written. She was a convicted felon. The title she had worn with pride for over a decade, teacher, was gone, erased, and replaced with this new, horrible word. As if on some silent cue, two bailiffs moved toward the defense table. Their footsteps echoed. One of them placed a hand gently on her arm. The touch was professional, but it was the touch of a captor. She was no longer permitted to sit with her husband. She was now property of the state. She managed to turn her head, just enough to look at David. His face was a mask of utter devastation, streaked with tears. She wanted to say she was sorry, but no sound would come out. Then her eyes drifted past him, to the back of the room. And she saw Maya Jenkins, standing by the door, watching. Her expression wasn't triumphant. It wasn't happy. It was just empty, final. And in that last, fleeting moment of freedom, Emma understood completely. Justice had been served. It just wasn't the justice she had been praying for. The verdict was the earthquake. The sentencing was the slow, crushing avalanche of rubble that buried you alive. There was a several-week gap between the two, a cruel purgatory where Emma was stuck in county jail, clinging to the faint, insane hope that the judge would see reason, that he'd give her probation, that he'd understand. The day of the sentencing, the courtroom felt different. Smaller. The formalities felt less like procedure and more like a ritual leading to an execution. Emma sat at the defense table, wearing a stiff, new dress her husband had brought her. She felt like a child playing dress-up, pretending to be a respectable adult when everyone in the room knew she was a convicted felon. First, the pre-sentencing report was read aloud. It was a dry, bureaucratic document that somehow managed to paint her as cold and unremorseful. It said she maintained her innocence regarding her intent, which was a legal way of saying she still didn't think she was a monster. The report twisted her defense into a denial of responsibility, and she felt the judge's disapproval like a physical chill. And then, the judge asked if the victim would like to make a statement. Maya Jenkins stood up. She walked to the podium, clutching a single index card. She didn't look at Emma. Her voice was quiet but clear, and you could have heard a pin drop in that room. "Your Honor," she began, "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just want you to know what was taken." She didn't talk about anger. She talked about the concrete details of a lost life. She talked about the campus she'd never walk, the classes she'd never take, the friends she'd never make. She talked about the smell of grease at the diner where she worked the graveyard shift, and how she'd sometimes stop and try to remember the smell of old books in the Stanford library she'd toured once. "A person's future isn't a thing you can hold," she said, her voice steady. "But when it's gone, the emptiness it leaves is real. It has a weight. I carry that weight every day. I wanted the court to know the weight of what happened here." She sat down. There were no dramatics, no tears, and that was what made it so devastating. It was just the truth, plain and simple. Then, it was the judge's turn. He put on his glasses, looked down at his notes, and then looked directly at Emma. His eyes were not unkind, but they were utterly unwavering. "Emma Rostov," he began, "this court has heard extensive testimony about your character, and I do not doubt that, for many years, you were a positive force in the lives of your students." He paused, letting a sliver of hope slip into Emma's heart. "But it was a trap. But that is precisely what makes this offense so egregious. You were in a position of immense trust. You were a gatekeeper of fairness, and you chose to betray that trust. You didn't just tell a lie. You corrupted the very system you were sworn to uphold. You became the embodiment of the privilege and inequality that a teacher is supposed to fight against." He leaned forward, his voice dropping, every word a hammer blow. "You were so focused on the potential you saw in one student, you were completely blind to the very real, very brilliant light you were extinguishing in another. That is not a mistake. That is a profound failure of moral clarity." He took a deep breath. The law is not just about punishment. It is about consequence. It is about sending a message. The message here is that no one is above the law, and that the collateral damage of a well-intentioned lie can be just as devastating as a malicious one. He then spoke the words that would define the next years of her life. "It is the judgment of this court that you are hereby sentenced to a term of 3 to 5 years in the state penitentiary. Bail is revoked. You are remanded to the custody of the sheriff." The gavel cracked. The sound was as sharp and final as a gunshot. As the bailiffs moved in to take her, Emma looked over at Maya. The girl was already walking away, out of the courtroom, leaving the wreckage of Emma's life behind. She didn't look back. She had said what she came to say. For her, it was over. For Emma, the real sentence was just beginning. The county jail was a holding cell. The state penitentiary was a tomb. The bus ride there was a journey into another world, one made of razor wire and gray concrete, surrounded by fields so flat and empty they seemed to swallow hope itself. The intake process was a masterclass in dehumanization. They took her dress, her underwear, the last remnants of her civilian life. She was issued a stiff orange jumpsuit that smelled of industrial bleach and the sweat of 100 women who came before her. They took her fingerprints again, her mugshot again, and then a female guard with tired eyes and no-nonsense hands performed a strip search. Emma had to obey every command, turn, cough, and spread, her body no longer her own. It was just property. Finally, they assigned her a number. Inmate number 78704. The name Emma Rostov was officially gone. Her first day in the general population was a lesson in a new kind of fear. The cafeteria wasn't a room. It was a cavern, roaring with the echoes of hundreds of voices and the clatter of metal trays. The air was thick with the smell of boiled potatoes and unwashed bodies. Eyes followed her, hard, curious, hostile eyes. She was a new fish. And worse, she was a teacher. Word got around fast. In prison, your crime is your brand. Thieves, drug dealers, women who fought back against abusive husbands, they had a certain understood code. But a teacher? A teacher who helped a rich kid cheat? She was an outsider. A pariah. A hulking woman with a spiderweb tattoo on her neck bumped into her deliberately in the chow line, spattering gravy on her jumpsuit. "Oops," the woman sneered. "Ain't you gonna give me a detention, teach?" The guards were no better. To them, she was just another number, another problem. When she asked a question, the response was a bored sigh. Figure it out, 78704. The kindness, the respect, the basic human courtesy she was used to, it was all gone. This was the new social contract. You were invisible until you were a nuisance. The only connection to her old life was the mail. David wrote to her every week. His letters were filled with desperate, cheerful news about Lily, about the house, about how much they missed her. But she could read between the lines. She could feel the strain in his handwriting. He was drowning, playing both mom and dad, dealing with the shame in their community, trying to explain to a 7-year-old why her mommy wasn't coming home. His love was a lifeline, but every letter also felt like a hammer, reminding her of the beautiful world she was no longer part of. One day, assigned to clean the prison's dismal library, a shelf of tattered paperbacks, she found a familiar cover. To Kill a Mockingbird. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She had taught this book for 10 years. She'd stood in front of her students and talked about justice, about integrity, about standing in someone else's shoes and seeing the world from their point of view. Now, the words felt like a cruel joke. She had failed every lesson she ever taught. She sat on the cold floor of that prison library, the familiar book in her hands, and she didn't see a story about heroism. She saw her own hypocrisy. This was her new classroom. And the only lesson left to learn was how to survive. Rock bottom isn't a cell. It isn't the bad food or the constant noise. Rock bottom is a silence that happens inside you. It's the moment you stop fighting the world and start facing yourself. For Emma, that moment came in solitary confinement. It started with a fight. Not a physical one. She wasn't brave or foolish enough for that. It was a war of words with another inmate who kept mocking her, hissing "teacher's pet" every time she walked by. One day, Emma just snapped. She screamed back, a raw, guttural sound filled with all the fear and anger she'd been swallowing for months. The guards didn't care who started it. She was thrown into the hole for 3 days as punishment. The solitary cell was a concrete box. A slab for a bed. A metal toilet. A slot in the door for food. And a silence so absolute it was deafening. There were no distractions here. No David-strained letters, no gossiping inmates, no clanging doors. It was just her, and the 4 walls, and the ghost of the person she used to be. In that terrible silence, the dam finally broke. She couldn't hide from the truth anymore. She saw it all with brutal clarity. She saw Ethan's manipulative tears. She saw the jury's stern faces. But most of all, she saw Maya Jenkins's empty expression. And for the first time, she stopped making excuses. She stopped saying, "I didn't know." She stopped being Emma Rostov, the wronged teacher. She started being Emma Rostov, the woman who had, through her own actions, ruined a life. A guard slid her dinner tray through the slot. It was a slop of lukewarm gruel. As he turned to leave, he muttered, "Enjoy, 78704. And in that moment, something shifted. The number, which had felt like a brand, now just felt accurate. Emma Rostov, the beloved teacher, was gone. That woman died in that courtroom. Inmate number 78704 was who was left. And this woman had a choice to make. She could spend the rest of her sentence, and the rest of her life, as a victim, drowning in self-pity and bitterness. Or she could finally, for the first time since this whole nightmare began, take responsibility. Not legal responsibility. The court had already handled that. This was deeper. This was moral responsibility. On her 3rd day in the hole, a thought emerged, clear and simple. The only honest thing she knew how to do was help people learn. She couldn't be a teacher anymore, but she could still read. She could still explain a math problem. The prison had a GED program that was always desperate for tutors. It was a small thing. A pathetic thing, maybe. But it was the only piece of her old self that wasn't built on a lie. When they let her out, she went straight to the prison administrator and signed up. Her first student was a terrified 19-year-old girl who couldn't read past a 2nd grade level. She wasn't a privileged kid from Oakwood Heights. She was a casualty of the same kind of neglect Emma had just participated in. As Emma sat down with her, patiently sounding out simple words, she wasn't trying to be a hero. She wasn't trying to earn redemption. She was just, finally, doing something for someone else with no thought for herself. That night, she took out a piece of paper. She didn't write to David. She wrote to Maya. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't explain herself. She simply wrote, "I now understand what I took from you. I am sorry." She folded the letter and tucked it inside her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She knew she would never send it. Some apologies aren't for the recipient. They're for the person writing them, a way to finally speak a truth into the silence. The day she was released felt nothing like she'd imagined. There was no sunshine breaking through clouds. No sense of victory. It was a bureaucratic transaction. They handed her back the clothes she'd worn at her sentencing, the stiff, unfamiliar dress, and a small envelope containing the $43 she'd had in her purse 3 years ago. The heavy gates didn't swing open dramatically. She was just ushered out a side door and it clicked shut behind her. And there they were. David and Lily. They stood by their car, a newer one she didn't recognize. David had aged a decade. His smile was wide, but it didn't reach his tired eyes. And Lily. Lily was a stranger. A tall, lanky 10-year-old who hovered behind her father, looking at Emma not with joy, but with a cautious, curious uncertainty. This wasn't her little girl. Her little girl was gone. The car ride home was silent. Not a peaceful silence. A thick, heavy silence filled with everything they couldn't say. David kept glancing at her, trying to start a sentence, but then just sighing and focusing on the road. Lily stared out the window. Emma watched the world fly by, a world that had moved on without her. New stores, new billboards, a faster pace. She felt like a ghost, invisible and out of sync. When they pulled into the driveway of their house, it didn't feel like coming home. It felt like visiting a museum. Everything was in its place, but it was all just objects. The life that had once animated them was gone. The couch where they'd cuddled, the table where they'd shared meals, it all felt like a staged set. Her own home was unfamiliar territory. That night, David tried to hug her, but his touch felt like a stranger's. Her body was stiff, unyielding. The connection they'd clung to through letters had evaporated in the stark reality of their shared space. He finally whispered, "It's okay, Emma. We'll get back to normal." But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that there was no normal to get back to. That life was over. The world outside had rules she no longer understood. She couldn't get a teaching license. Her degree was worthless now. After a few humiliating interviews where she had to explain the 3-year gap in her resume, she finally took the only job she could get, the night clerk at a 24-hour copy shop. The fluorescent lights hummed, the copy machines whirred, and she spent her nights alone, listening to the silence and remembering the noise of her classroom. One slow night, fueled by a pain she couldn't name, she typed a name into the computer. Maya Jenkins. And there she was. On the website of a state university. An article highlighting non-traditional students. Maya, her face more mature, but her eyes still holding that same serious light. The article detailed her journey, how she'd worked full-time at a diner while taking classes at community college, and had just transferred to the university to finish her degree in engineering. She had done it. Against all odds, without the scholarship, without help, she had clawed her way back. Emma stared at the screen, the hum of the copiers fading into the background. She felt a bizarre, painful mix of shame and awe. Maya hadn't been destroyed. She had been forged in the fire Emma had started. Emma's punishment was over, but Maya's triumph was just beginning. And in that sterile, brightly lit copy shop, Emma Rostov finally understood that her prison sentence hadn't been the hard part. Living with the consequence was. The article about Maya stayed burned onto the back of Emma's eyelids. She'd see it when she was sorting copies, or stocking paper, or trying to sleep in the too-quiet house. This girl, this woman, had climbed a mountain that Emma had pushed her down. And she was about to stand at the summit. The university's website had the details. The spring commencement. This Saturday, 10 a.m. Maya Jenkins, College of Engineering. A war broke out inside Emma. One side, the old, fearful side, screamed at her to stay away. "What good can you do?" it hissed. "You'll only ruin her day. She doesn't want to see you. You're the ghost at her feast. Stay in the shadows where you belong." It was the logical choice. The safe choice. It was what David begged her to do when she tentatively brought it up. "Emma, please," he'd said, his voice strained with a fresh layer of worry. "Don't tear open old wounds. For her, and for you. Let it go." But the other side of her, the part that had been forged in the silence of solitary confinement, spoke with a quieter, stronger voice. It didn't care about logic. It didn't care about comfort. It said, "This isn't about what you want, or what you fear. This is about bearing witness." She wasn't going for forgiveness. She wasn't going to talk to Maya or disrupt her life. She was going for the same reason someone might finally visit a grave. Not to bring the dead back to life, but to finally, truly, accept that they are gone. She needed to see, with her own eyes, the future she had tried to destroy, living and breathing and triumphing without her. It was a form of punishment, yes. But it was also a form of respect. 2 days before the graduation, she went to the bus station. It was a grimy, quiet place, a world away from the leafy lanes of Oakwood Heights. She didn't tell David. She just went. She walked up to the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. "1 ticket to Middleton," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For Saturday morning. Return trip for the evening." The clerk slid the ticket under the glass partition. It was just a small piece of paper, but it felt as heavy as a brick. She held it in her hand, staring at the destination. Middleton, where the university was. Where Maya was. She wasn't going as Emma Rostov, the teacher. She wasn't going as Emma Rostov, the convicted felon. She was going as a spectator. An audience of one. She had to see the person she had wronged cross that stage. She had to finally, fully, understand the cost of her lie, not in years served, but in a life lived brilliantly in spite of her. She put the ticket in her pocket. The decision was made. The university auditorium was massive, a sea of folding chairs and proud families. The air was thick with the buzz of 1,000 conversations, the rustle of programs, the flash of cameras. Emma slipped in just as the ceremony was starting and found a seat in the very last row, tucked away in the shadows. She felt like a ghost, invisible in the crowd. She watched the procession of students in their caps and gowns, a river of black and blue. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic, nervous rhythm. What was she doing here? This was a mistake. She was an intruder. And then, she saw her. Maya. Walking tall, her gown flowing, her cap perched perfectly on her head. She wasn't the quiet, broken girl from the courtroom anymore. She was a young woman, poised and confident, her face lit with a quiet pride as she found her seat with the other engineering graduates. Emma didn't breathe. She just watched. She watched through the long, boring speeches. She watched as the dean called out name after name. She clapped when parents around her clapped, her own hands making soft, lonely sounds. Then, the moment came. Maya Jenkins. Summa cum laude. Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. The air left Emma's lungs. Maya walked across the stage, her stride sure and steady. She shook the dean's hand, accepted her diploma, and turned to face the crowd for a brief, shining moment. A genuine, triumphant smile broke across her face. And in that exact second, as if pulled by some invisible string, Maya's eyes lifted from the cheering mass and found Emma's. All the way in the back. In the shadows. Time stopped. There was no anger in Maya's gaze. No hatred. No forgiveness, either. It was just recognition. A deep, profound, and utterly calm acknowledgement. She saw Emma. She knew exactly why she was there. And for a single suspended heartbeat, they held that look, the destroyer and the survivor, connected across a crowded room by a shared, painful history. Then Maya turned, her smile still in place, and walked off the stage. It was over. Emma didn't wait for the end. She stood up, her legs shaky, and walked out of the auditorium. The bright sunlight outside was blinding. She didn't look back. As she walked toward the bus stop, a strange feeling settled over her. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief. It was closure. The weight she'd been carrying for years, the crushing guilt, it was still there, but it had transformed. It was no longer a sharp, stabbing pain. It was a heavy stone she could now carry without collapsing. She had borne witness. She had seen the life that flourished not because of her, but in spite of her. And in that final silent look, she was finally given permission to stop punishing herself and simply remember. The debt would never be paid, but the bill was no longer coming due every single day. And as I walked away from that auditorium, I finally understood what the jury saw in those 18 minutes. It wasn't just a lie. It was a chain reaction. It was the absolute, unforgiving weight of a consequence I never intended, but was entirely mine to bear. The prison sentence ended, but the real atonement, that was just beginning. If this story left you wondering where the line between justice and forgiveness truly lies, subscribe for more. Next week's story is about a firefighter who heard a voice in a burning house that had been empty for 50 years.